Okay, so you want to own a satellite, build something, launch it into space, beam signals down to Earth, collect a check from anyone who needs to talk, watch television, or get online in places cables can't reach. Here's the problem. There is a piece of real estate floating 236 miles above your head right now that costs nothing to claim and almost everything to keep, and almost nobody on the ground has any idea it exists. Hold on to that, because by the end of this video, that one piece of invisible real estate is going to explain almost everything about why some satellite companies print money for decades and others lose hundreds of millions of dollars before a single signal reaches Earth. Before making this video, I went through insurance industry reports on satellite launch risk, the actual United Nations treaty that decides who gets to put a satellite where, and public filings from the companies that lease out space in orbit for a living. Most of what's in this video never makes it past a space enthusiast forum, and by the end of it, you'll understand why companies quietly file paperwork for satellites they have no intention of ever building, why one of the most expensive insurance claims in the industry's history came from a satellite that never even fully opened, and the one number expressed as a simple percentage that decides whether your satellite business becomes one of the most profitable machines ever built or one of the fastest ways to lose everything. To understand any of that, you first need to see what you're actually buying when you build a satellite, and it isn't the satellite. There isn't one way to own a satellite business. There are three, and each one is really a different bet on how much risk you're willing to strap to a rocket. At the small end, a single CubeSat, the shoebox-sized satellites used for imaging or short-term data missions, can get built and launched for as little as $150,000 to $1 million depending on the payload, using rideshare launches that split the cost of a rocket across dozens of small satellites at once. In the middle sits a full constellation play, dozens or hundreds of small satellites working together in low orbit, where a single mid-sized satellite alone can cost $1 to several million before launch, and the launch itself is billed by the kilogram, currently running anywhere from roughly $700 a kilogram on a reused rocket to over $20,000 a kilogram on smaller dedicated launchers. At the top sits the business that actually built this entire industry, a single large geostationary communications satellite, the kind that hangs motionless over one spot on Earth forever, broadcasting television and data to an entire continent. Building and launching one of these currently costs between $200 and $400 million all in before it has broadcast a single signal. So the size you pick isn't really a business decision. It's a bet on how much of the sky you're trying to claim. Which brings us to the real estate almost nobody knows exists. That geostationary spot, the one that lets a satellite hover permanently over the same patch of Earth, only exists at one specific altitude in one specific ring around the planet. There are roughly 800 usable positions along that entire ring, and once a spot is taken, it's effectively gone. Here's the part nobody tells you. Getting one of those spots costs nothing. There's no purchase price, no auction, no bidding war with a government. The United Nations agency that manages this, called the ITU, hands them out on a first-come, first-served basis. File the paperwork before anyone else does, and the position is functionally yours. But here's the twist that turns this free real estate into one of the strangest hidden markets in the world. Companies have learned they can file for a slot years before they ever intend to build the satellite that would go there. Industry insiders call these paper satellites filings that exist purely on paper, registered to hold a valuable position in the sky while the company figures out, sometimes for years, whether it's actually worth building anything. Those filings get held, negotiated over, sometimes effectively rented out to companies that have the money to build a satellite but showed up to the filing office too late. Free real estate that anyone can claim on paper and nobody else can touch once it's claimed. That's the actual asset underneath this entire industry. Now here's the mechanism that decides whether owning that spot in the sky makes you rich or bankrupt. Once you've got your position and your satellite is actually built and launched, the business itself runs almost entirely on leasing capacity. Think of a satellite like an apartment building floating in space. It doesn't sell one product. It rents out individual rooms called transponders to broadcasters, telecom companies, and governments who need to move signals from one point on Earth to another. SES, one of the largest satellite operators on the planet, generated more than $1.9 billion in 2024 from exactly this kind of leasing alone. High demand frequency bands, the kind used for enterprise data and government contracts, now lease at a premium of 18 to 22% above standard rates. Once a satellite is up there and healthy, this business throws off remarkably stable, high margin revenue for years, sometimes over a decade, off a single piece of hardware you already paid for. But two forces are working against anyone trying to build this business today, and both of them can turn that stable apartment building into a very expensive piece of space debris. The first is that failure happens at the worst possible moment, before you've earned a single dollar. Industry data shows launch failure risk currently sits between 2 and 6%, and even satellites that survive launch face roughly a 7% chance of a serious failure within their first year in orbit. Because of that risk, launch insurance typically runs between 5 and 25% of the satellite's total value depending on the year and the rocket's track record, meaning insuring a $300 million satellite can cost tens of millions of dollars on its own, layered on top of the build cost before it has generated a cent. The second force is newer and structural. Low Earth orbit constellations, hundreds or thousands of small satellites flying much closer to the planet, are now delivering internet and data services that used to be the exclusive territory of the big geostationary operators, and they're doing it with lower latency and lower cost per satellite. The business that used to feel untouchable at the top of the sky is now being squeezed from below by an entirely different orbital strategy, which brings us to what happens when even a well-funded, technically sophisticated company gets this wrong at the worst possible scale. This isn't the first time the industry has learned this lesson the hard way. Back in 1999, a company called Iridium built an entire constellation of 66 low Earth orbit satellites to offer global satellite phone service at a total cost of roughly $5 billion. The engineering worked, the satellites flew. The problem was the business underneath them. Cell phone network on the ground expanded faster and cheaper than anyone at Iridium had planned for. The handsets were bulky and expensive, and the pricing never attracted enough paying subscribers to cover the debt taken on to build the system. Iridium filed for bankruptcy less than a year after its satellites went fully operational, and its entire constellation, the one that cost $5 billion to build, was eventually sold off for roughly $25 million. The hardware worked exactly as designed. The utilization rate never showed up. More recently, in 2023, a geostationary broadband satellite called Viasat-3 F1 launched with a reflector, the giant dish-like structure that focuses its signal, built on a Boeing satellite platform. Shortly after reaching orbit, the reflector failed to deploy correctly. The company confirmed the satellite would never be replaced and would operate at less than 10% of its planned capacity for its entire operational life. Viasat filed an insurance claim of $420 million, one of the largest single claims in the history of the space insurance industry. That single claim was large enough to visibly shake the entire global space insurance market, pushing several insurers to raise premiums across the board for everyone else in the industry that same year. One mechanical failure on one satellite in one company's fleet changed what every other satellite operator on the planet had to pay to ensure their own launches that year. Between Iridium and Viasat, the lesson is the same lesson told two different ways. One company built something that worked perfectly and still went bankrupt because nobody wanted to pay for it. The other built something that broke and still had to keep paying for it anyway. That's the structural risk underneath this entire business. You're not just betting on your own satellite working. You're betting on demand showing up on schedule and on an industry-wide insurance market that reprices itself instantly the moment anyone else's satellite fails. So what does this actually look like on a real balance sheet? This is where that 1% I promised you finally shows up. It's called utilization rate. The share of your satellite's total transponder capacity that's actually leased out and earning revenue at any given time, as opposed to sitting empty. Get that number right, and the business is one of the highest margin machines in modern commerce. Get it wrong, and you're making insurance and debt payments on a piece of hardware in space earning almost nothing. Let's run two realistic versions of your satellite business and watch what that single percentage does to each one. Option 1, a small constellation operator building a fleet of 20 mid-size low Earth orbit satellites for data and imaging services. Total build and launch cost, using current per kilogram launch rates, lands around $40 to $60 million for the full fleet. At a healthy 70% utilization rate leasing capacity to commercial and government clients, annual revenue can reach $15 to $25 million, translating to a net margin in the 20 to 30% range once ground operations and staff are covered, putting real annual profit between $3 and $7.5 million. Option 2, a single large geostationary communication satellite serving an entire continent. Build and launch cost lands between $200 and $400 million, plus insurance running an additional 15 to 25% of that value in the first year alone. At an 80% utilization rate, comparable to SES's real transponder leasing performance, annual revenue can reach $40 to $60 million over the satellite's operational life, which often runs 15 years or more, producing tens of millions of dollars in cumulative profit over that lifespan. Drop that utilization rate from 80% to 40% without changing a single dollar of what you spent building and launching the satellite, and the entire economics collapse, because the satellite, the insurance, and the ground infrastructure cost exactly the same, whether every transponder is leased or half of them sit empty in the dark. So here's the ownership verdict on a satellite. Capital intensity, 10 out of 10, since even the cheapest version of this business costs hundreds of thousands of dollars before a single kilogram reaches orbit, and the geostationary version costs hundreds of millions. Regulatory and legal risk, 7 out of 10, because the ITU filing process is free but slow, congested, and increasingly contested as more countries and companies compete for the same limited positions. Margin stability, 8 out of 10, because once a satellite is healthy in orbit and its capacity is leased out, the revenue is remarkably steady for over a decade. Structural moat, 9 out of 10, because as the paper satellite phenomenon shows, the scarcest asset in this entire business isn't the hardware, it's a position in the sky that only exists in finite supply and can't be manufactured or expanded no matter how much money you have. Overall ownership verdict, 8 out of 10. You're not really in the business of building satellites. You're in the business of claiming a piece of invisible real estate 22,236 miles above the Earth before anyone else files the paperwork first. And once you hold it, almost nothing except your own hardware failing can take it away from you. And if you're watching this with exactly $0 in your bank account, don't worry, you didn't miss your shot at owning a satellite. You just found out the sky has a waiting list too, and for once, you're not even on it.